Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is crystallized thinking, or perhaps it could be thinking about crystals and crystallization. My guest is my good friend, James Tunney. He is the author of The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution. Also, The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism. Empire of Scientism, the dispiriting conspiracy and inevitable tyranny of scientocracy. Tech bondage, slavery of the human spirit. Human entrance to transhumanism, machine merger and the end of humanity, and most recently, plantation of the automatons. James lives in Gothenburg, Sweden, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. Once again, it's a pleasure to be with you.
It's great to see your liquid crystal face again.
Well, I had an interesting insight this morning about our topic. I was originally thinking of calling it crystallization of consciousness. And then it occurred to me, consciousness is probably, at least in terms of pure spirit, can never be crystallized. It's infinite in a way. What gets crystallized isn't consciousness per se. It's something that rests above consciousness that you could call thinking or mentation. Yeah,
I think you've hit the nub of the matter. We don't have to proceed beyond that, Jeff. That was very, very astute. That's right. And I think there's a great problem here in that people who are interested in consciousness from a very reductionist, ultra-materialist perspective, they tend to focus on the carrier of consciousness and not the content of consciousness. And if you look at people who are very well-informed in both contexts, like Penrose, he in the end says that mathematics won't be able to explain consciousness. And that is interesting coming from a person who understands crystals and crystallography, and I think is in favor of a more generalized idea of crystallography, recognizing that it's a pervasive idea. And he has worked on the minutiae of how consciousness works. But in a lot of cases, what these people are doing, the good ones, are identifying the basis on which are the conditions for consciousness to operate on. And if you look at people like Federico Fagin and others, they seem to be suggesting really that the human physical form operates in a way that makes us receptive to, or quantumly receptive. So mentation, I think that's a very good idea, and as you've described it, and it refers or indicates the fundamental nature of crystals. And I tend to more and more think that we should change our idea of crystals more away from the noun to the verb, to the crystal state, and recognize that, as you have suggested, our thinking process refers to a context whereby a structure is formed in a diverse element, and sometimes we're too crystallized. But I think that's right. Consciousness is too complex to be reduced to some element. It may be that in future the conception of consciousness is more determined in terms of, there's an idea of it, there's an E8 crystal, for example, a complex crystal, but it could be regarded as a series of interlocking crystalline structures, but still there will be something bigger than the individual elements.
While we do tend to get crystallized, you could be crystallized as a parapsychologist or as a Marxist or as a Catholic or as a patriot. At the same time, there's always the potential for consciousness, pure consciousness, to break through the crystallization.
Yes, that's very well put. And people like Stendhal and the German writer wrote about crystallization, the psychology of crystallization in relation to love, for example. He uses the process of salt crystallization to explain psychologically how he worked. Now, as a result of this and my study of crystals, I've come to an idea that there's a very basic dichotomy in a lot of human thinking. And this is related to what you said, and it comes down to a situation where people form a worldview which is essentially crystalline. And as a result of that, they see the human as a being effectively in a crystal state, and they believe that there's associated political views associated with the state they live in. And some of these also want to create a world state. So the state also, when we think of that, has a number of different connotations. And so that focuses on form and structure, and crystals are defined in essence by their lattice structure, by the if we take a chessboard, for example, a simple lattice structure indicates the orderliness and arrangement of the internal structure of crystals. And there seems to be a desire from certain people to extrapolate from that orderliness to the imposition of an orderliness on society and an arrangement on society. And on the other side, there are people who believe, who prioritize and privilege consciousness and realize that consciousness is above the crystalline form, that the content of consciousness is something different. And I would argue that this is more in accord with my and many other people's ideas of consciousness as light. So there's an intense and very close nexus between crystalline structure and light. On the LCD screens, we have the light and the liquid crystals. The internal structure of crystals was really made available through the technology of X-rays. So X-rays enabled this application of the X-rays to crystals enabled people like Max von Laue and the Bragg family and all the others, Bernal and all the other great crystallographers, to look inside and to understand through the diffraction pattern of atoms and molecules how the internal structure was. And that was the important technology. So we have the connection between light and crystals. And in spiritual terms, we could look at Jacob Boehme, who talked really in terms of spiritual alchemy. And he has a kind of salt in the middle of mercury and sulfur. Now, salt, of course, is a crystal. If we go back to Jesus in the Bible, in Matthew, Jesus says, "Ye are the salt of the earth." And then he says also that, but you can lose your saltiness. And then he proceeds to say that you should shine your light and not hide your light under a bushel. So the salt is the form, and it's an aspect and an important aspect of our form, but it's the light is the primary influence. And I would equate that light with consciousness. So we mustn't confuse the macro world of consciousness with its micro manifestations, and we mustn't confuse the content with the carrier. And that's where the real nub of the matter. A lot of people that believe that they can control consciousness believe that it's merely a matter of a rearrangement of the human mind and the human physiology so that they become less unpredictable. And in that way, of course, we'd lose free will.
There is a sense, if you take a prism, for example, which is a crystalline form, and you shine light through it, then the light can radiate into different colors. White light becomes a whole rainbow of colors. So the relationship between the light of consciousness and the crystallization of form is very important.
Yes, but we get similar effects whether we use glass or crystals in some of the things, depending on the planes that are available. But if you even look at, there's a difference of emphasis between Newton and Goethe in relation to how light behaved. And Goethe criticized Newton in relation to not so much the fundamental insights that Newton had, but about the nature and the conduct of experiments, about how Newton did the experiment. And Goethe realized that that wasn't the full story, that in fact he noticed in daylight and in ordinary context, looking through certain glasses, that the color appears between darkness and light. And this is an important thing that people forget. If we come along with a Newtonian idea, we can fail to see some of the deeper insights that come about from a different perspective. And associated with the idea of crystals is a fundamental idea that crystals enable us to access different dimensions. There's a fundamental aspect of dimensionality about that. So crystals are on the cusp or between different worlds. That's why they're used in communication devices. They're used in quartz is used in computers and communication devices. And I remember you talking in one of your talks about, I think it might have been Mr. Simmons when you talked about crystals, about your crystal radio. And a lot of people don't realize that you can make a radio with crystals without batteries. Sometimes they use foxhole radios. They were used during the war. But that's the same process again. The crystal enables us to access a different world. Now, one little point on this, crystals have been used in the ancient world, and people knew this. They knew some of these elements. Well, if we take the mythic and legendary places like Atlantis, people like Casey said that crystals were the important technology that were used there, according to his visions. But we see that, if we take the Irish example, in all the ancient sites, there is quartz is found, and there's various theories about why the quartz is there. And there are various theories that suggest they may be used for their they may have been used for their electrical effects. And one of the there's a number of words for the quartz in the Irish language. There may be cluck, cluck is a word for the stone. So there may be cluck gala or green cluck associated with the sun, sunstone. Or there may be clucka ushla, which means the noble stone. And that word ushla, the same word was used in relation to the fairies. And they're found in the sites associated with the fairies. So this is, again, about the other dimensionality associated with crystals. And that trend went right up from the various writings in the Greeks, through alchemy, through the quest for the philosopher's stone, to people like on the cusp of modern science like John Dee, who used crystals to communicate with angels and who used crystals as a show stone, for example, a communication with other worlds. So it's funny that crystals are very structured in one form, but if we begin to think of crystallization, we can see that it's also about transformation, about mutability, and about creating links with different dimensions. So I suggest sometimes, more recently, I'm thinking that our idea of crystals and in the New Age shop is a kind of very reductive view as well of crystal structure and crystal state, and we have to think of it as a series of mutable transformative possibilities, especially when we're talking about liquid crystals and time crystals and other ideas of plasmodic crystals and photonic crystals associated with reflection of light, for example, in a peacock's tail.
I'm reminded of the biblical story of, I believe, if I recall correctly, Lot's wife. During the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, she turned and looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt.
That came into my head, funny enough, today, and I was thinking about that, and it's funny. Now, again, without relying on this very unduly literalistic reading of the context, because that's people like Swedenborg that say you have to look at these on different levels. But it is interesting that the perception of the divine punishment was turning into a pillar of salt, and that for me, and another view, well, we could take another view, because if you look at some of the feminist readings of that, they're sympathetic towards Lot and say, well, this is curiosity, and this ties in with the prodigal son example, and why would that be punished so much just for looking back? And that's perfectly understandable when we're talking about the Old Testament context. But on another view, on a different level, there is an example, independently of the story, of the idea that the divine punishment represents a reduction to purely crystalline form without anything else. So in that context, you might argue that the light was taken out of the body, the animating force, the animating consciousness. So the pillar of salt represents, in some ways, the deadliness of only relying on the structure and the form without the content. There could be that reading in relation to, there is crystals were critical in Judaism early on. They seem to have been, and stones were very important, and the stone element is very important in graves and small stones, but also precious stones, and also in conceptions of paradise. And the stones that are chosen to be important tend to have a connection with technology. So, for example, rubies, which were always regarded as important esoterically, become the basis of laser technology. And there are some people that believe that some of the stories in the Bible represented, associated with the Ark of the Covenant and other things, represented or indicate knowledge of the application of higher level technologies using crystals. So there is this idea of ancient technology. But yeah, I think in some ways that Lot's wife, although I'm not going to use it in that context, would represent the idea of merely focusing on form and not focusing on the content.
Well, certainly there is this notion, and perhaps Bernal, who was a crystallographer, is the archetypal example of it, that the perfection of the human body or the human being is to become crystallized into some sort of an immovable, stable, unchanging form.
That's right, and I'm glad you mentioned him, because he really is a critical scientist of the 20th century, and he's critical in relation to crystallography. And you have interviewed Crick, and Crick would have had communicated or closely worked with Bernal, so that puts you close to these people. Bernal fit in with that with those great crystallographers, the Braggs and Ashbury, and there was a kind of triangle of concentration on crystals from London to Cambridge, and later and presently to Oxford. They have the Diamond Light lab there, which seems to be quite spectacular. But Bernal, of course, we've talked about him before, who wrote The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, as well as working on the structure of water. And we've talked to your nephew, who was working on or telling us about the structure of water and the incredible complexity of water. Well, Bernal worked on that. He also worked on graphite. And graphite, of course, continues to be a critical technology in its more recent manifestations in graphene. And graphene is one of the main candidates for the great technology in relation to brain-computer interface. So Bernal was also working on basically the essence of life, and he was there in the center of the group of people out of which the DNA helix structure came. There was also Rosalind Franklin, and Ashbury had worked on that as well. And another thing that people forget about is, we've talked about crystals and plants are very much connected. And a lot of the advances in relation to crystals are associated with investigations in relation to plants. So one of the things they were investigating was the structure of the tobacco mosaic virus. And this was something that botanists had studied in the 19th century. Now, you don't have to be a genius to work out why, because tobacco was a valuable product associated with colonialism, and any virus that affected that had consequences, and that was why they investigated it. And later on, in the 1930s, they came up with the structure of this virus. But the word virus and virology comes from that plant context. It doesn't come from the human context. The use of virus as we understand it come from that plant context. So virology as well came into this study of crystallography. And as well as that, we have to mention Schrödinger and his lectures in Dublin, 1942, 1943, which led to, or which was published as What is Life? And in that he anticipated the DNA by identifying the possibility that it was an aperiodic crystal. So life itself was seen to be, by some, a crystal objective. Now, Bernal, as we said before, was a Stalinist. Despite his great crystallography interest, he was a Stalinist. And he said, of course, that in his book, The World of Flesh and the Devil, that scientific corporations would take over the world by stealth, that humans would transform into mechanical beings, into silicon beings. People that didn't want to do that would live in the human zoo, that the elite class of scientists would prepare for space exploration where they could escape, and they could escape the zoo that they had created. It's a terrible vision that's he doesn't get criticized sufficiently for. And it's very, very interesting that this ultra-materialist perspective associated with certain crystallographers, I'm not saying it's inevitable, but his assistant, Dorothy Crowfoot, or Dorothy Hodgkin, was also another communist. She was against nuclear, or she was in favor of nuclear disarmament. So we can't put them all in the same category. But she was a communist, and there was a great interaction between Moscow, China, and London, and there was visits from the Russian Bukharin, and that came to with a scientific delegation. So there was a political influence on that, and Bernal wrote a glowing tribute to Stalin when he died in 1953, lauding him as a great scientist, which is incredible. But also, the people that are interested in crystallography in Britain, they also lauded Elena Ceausescu as a great crystallographer, although that's very suspect. Interestingly, one of students of Dorothy Hodgkin was Margaret Thatcher, who worked on a particular crystal. So it doesn't mean that you're going to be left wing, but there is a similarity, whether from the left or the right, an extrapolation perhaps about society and how society can be represented in a crystalline form, which would be my critique of Teilhard de Chardin. He I think fits into the crystalline structure, but Bernal had this. He is the essence of this transhumanist perspective. He is the essence of the representation of human life as essentially crystalline, which means that we should become more crystalline, more crystallized, and consciousness should be crystallized in structures removing the predictability. So it's a very deep and dark possibilities in one stream associated with this worldview, which when it becomes too deep. And the last point, Jeff, of course, Bernal, Crick and Watson Watson works Cold Spring Harbor. They continue to work on this, what is life and virology, and it leads to a situation, I think, that we talked about before in relation to the executive order, about this fusion of information and biology. That's where it leads to, the programmable individual, and that stream is very strong, and one that I obviously don't support.
Well, in a sense, it seems to me that it boils down to a feeling that the universe is basically chemical in nature, that everything is molecular, and pretty much all molecules have a crystalline structure. So if that's your worldview, then naturally things that seem to transcend the molecular crystallization of reality, things, for example, like quantum leaps, might seem threatening.
Yes, and it's interesting. That's interesting you use the word quantum leap, because leap in a number of languages is saltar or saltimbanco, and acrobat is salt. So there's a connection apparently between the word salt, crystalline, and leap. Now, why that is another area of investigation, but there's no question about that. And I think certainly Federico Fagin and people that allow for that access to the quantum realm are very aware, and for him, through his mystical experience, of the limitations of the mathematical reductive method. And the dangerous ones are the ones who have an unduly left brain mentality, to use Ian McGilchrist's analogy. This is where it comes into play, because in accordance with how he has analyzed the dangers of the left brain becomes blind to realities that it can't perceive. And there's a great love of structure and predictability. And out of that, there becomes this kind of fear of unpredictability. And there's a great desire to extend predictability through crystallization, through making everything into a structure. And of course, the origin of the word crystal is associated with ice and frost in the Greek. It's also the prefix in the word cryogenics in relation to the freezing of the body, although they can't, of course, freeze the body internally. They have to replace it with a liquid, because if they did, they would destroy it, because you can't have crystals in the body. Frostbite. When people say, "Oh, I love crystals," in the old way that I would criticize people say, "I love crystals," you can ask them whether they like frostbite, which is based on crystallization of liquids in the extremities, or kidney stones or bladder stones, because they're crystallization processes as well. So again, there's a whole range of processes, a whole range of context. But where we reduce our worldview to a process, to a mechanical process, a chemical process, and of course with Schrödinger they were bringing physics and chemistry and biology together. But if it comes together out of a very restricted worldview, well, then it's going to be dangerous. And when we look at another interesting thing about all these, a lot of the main crystallographers, they didn't start out and say, "I'm going to investigate the tobacco mosaic virus." They didn't start out and say, "I'm going to investigate graphite." They investigated them. In a lot of cases, if you look at their biographies, they were given a thing to do. Either their supervisor said, "I want you to investigate this," or there was a list of topics that were recommended to them, because these areas were what interested, in particular, the imperial class, the imperial ruling class. They knew that these technologies were critical. They knew for some reason that that graphite was important, and graphite becomes the basis of graphene. They knew that these things, and some of the reason why they knew these things were important was because these things had always been important. They'd always been important in esoteric terms. If John Dee could be interested in crystals because of their ability to communicate with other beings, there must be something in it. And another example I would use of this deadly crystalline approach is, although they're very intelligent and bright people, so I'm not ridiculing their intellectual capabilities. I'm saying they're blinded in some way. But H.G. Wells wrote Anticipations, a book in 1901, which is a despicable book. It's one of his worst books. It could have been written by a Nazi. It was really, he talks about this idea of what is essentially a Superman who is really without compassion, that will destroy and kill people. It's a nasty book. And 3 years before that, he wrote The Crystal Egg in 1897. And The Crystal Egg, interestingly, was about a man in London who finds an egg that enables him, a crystal egg that enables him to communicate with Mars, or to see what's happening on Mars. And this is interesting because this is how the technology was used. But that fits into John Dee, who had a crystal egg as well. So there's a continuity between the magic, the esoteric, the secret, the hermetic even, the alchemical, and the scientific interest. So in it as well is an element of sorcery. So there is a current of sorcery that comes into it. And the last point, if we think that it's not relevant to the governance of modern countries, I think with the coronation of Prince Charles that he will be enthroned on top of the Stone of Destiny, which is an ancient stone. There's other stories about that we could talk about for ages. But it shows the link again between stones, of course, or crystals are a form of stones, and power. And I'm not saying about sorcery in relation to King Charles, sorry. But there is this link. Remember that sorcerers are always employed by the powerful. People get that wrong. In history, the sorcerers were employed by the people that are powerful, and it's the powerful who are interested in sorcery. And there is this sorceress element, and that's a word that has been used by scientists as a critique of other scientists, where they focus on the power which is unleashed instead of the using science for the good of people and the world.
When I was an undergraduate studying psychology, I read the work of Professor Frank Barron, and later I met him. He was a student of creativity and the relationship between creativity and personality. And he had some simple tests. He'd ask people to create a little drawing, something that you like. And he found that the least creative people would make drawings that were geometric, that were crystalline, and that the most creative people, he had what he called tolerance of ambiguity. The drawings they made were very vague, cloud-like and amorphous, and that ability to appreciate ambiguity, things that are not crystallized, seemed to be, in his work, the essential distinction between a creative person and one who was not.
Well, that's a beautiful point in relation to and it puts its finger on an essential point. And I see that in relation to art and how people look at pictures, because people that are not very creative want paintings to be kind of photographic and fixed, so they can recognize it and they can control in their head what it is, and they prize reproduction of photographic reproduction, for example. They don't like things which are amorphous. And in crystals, if you look at the origin of liquid crystals, and that's very, very interesting, because again, it came from a plant source. Friedrich Reinitzer in 1888 discovered these liquid crystals. They were known about, but so that they were identified as flüssige Kristall, I think in the German. And so what is very interesting, to tie back on what we talked about last week, in The Simpsons, the movie, when they're putting the glass dome on Springfield. Now again, this is another manifestation in the direction of the Crystal Palace. They're putting the dome, and I think it's Mo, who's the bar owner, is there with a crowd of people who are obviously a bit surprised and a bit unhappy about this glass dome being suddenly put on their town. And there's a projection of the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and he appears so they can communicate like we're communicating now. And Mo says to this projection, he says, "What do you mean, that we're going to be trapped in this place like rats?" And the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency says, "No, not like rats. Rats are easy to trap, more like carrots." And I couldn't figure out why he chose carrots. And interestingly, liquid crystals were discovered in the investigation of different boiling points in carrots. So it's a funny connection. I wonder whether there's a reference to that. But when they discover these liquid crystals, what happens is when they boil at different temperatures, the form changes. So you can get beautiful colors. And one woman, there was a lot of famous and brilliant women crystallographers. They led the way in many senses. And in Holland, there was two individuals who had some sort of relationship. One was a communist called Goethe, who was very significant in the spread of Marxist thinking, and he had a relationship with Ida Prince, who studied crystals, and she was very interested in liquid crystals because of the beautiful colors in it. So in that phase, you get a different, less structure. The structure changes into something which is different and something which is more beautiful. And this aesthetic attraction is written in some way, in my view, into the universe, that we have an intuitive attraction to these things that are significant. So people always understood that there was something important in opal or any of the other important gemstones, in particular because of photonic crystals, that the way they catch the light reveals what's in a crystal and attracts people to that, and then they become interested in the other uses. So with liquid crystals, again, there's a similar attraction, and there's a crossover between art and crystallography. It seems to have influenced cubism, and there's a kind of crystal cubism form, if you like. And if you'd be looking more at expressionism or impressionism, perhaps to look at later on for that amorphous feeling in art. But the beauty of them is written. There's a path, as we've talked about before, in a way. There's clues that you follow, and once you follow and focus on the thing, you will come to a solution. So in both senses, the spiritual tradition and the scientific tradition focus on similar things, but they come up with different results. And it's the in-between, it's the marriage of the two that we need. And this is what Burma was talking about, getting the thing between. And this is what this salt or crystallization, the alchemists sought, is about, getting something out which reconciles. So we can't have one or the other, because one will seek to triumph over the other. So that's right, and that's when the crystal is in its classic mineral form at room temperature or whatever, that we get this rigidity, this structure, this mathematical beauty that appeals to people because it's predictable, using all the scales, the Mohs scale for hardness, the Beauvais lattice system, and the work done by Miller, the Miller index from 1839, when they began to classify these structures. They become predictable, and for mathematicians they can predict what's going to happen. But the liquid crystal phase is different, and it accords more with that creativity. But I agree with you. I think that insight is important, and there is something deep in that separate left brain, right brain.
My wife, Janelle, who amongst other things is a specialist in stress management, used little liquid crystals called biodots, and she'd give them out in her stress management seminars. You just put it right on your skin, and as your temperature changes, the biodot changes color. So it's a measure of when people get stressed out, their temperature will change, and by looking at the biodot, you gives you some feedback about what's going on inside your own body. It can be a very useful thing. And you mentioned that your children have these mood rings, which are similar.
Yes, yeah. So the mood rings have the liquid crystal as well, and I think myelin in the nerve coatings in the body is liquid crystalline form. So the body uses liquid crystals, and the presence of crystals, liquid crystals, and other crystals in the bodies are critical, and they're critical not least in some of the domains in your domain and parapsychology, because scientists have been looking at. Although it's a bit funny because a lot of the scientists say, oh, well, this crystal healing and all this, there's no evidence, although they don't say that they haven't gone looking for the evidence, and all the while they're actually studying crystallography all the time. There's loads of crystallographers have received Nobel Prize, so they know about the power of crystals. But then we have to consider that in the body there's magnetite in the brain, which is magnetic, and there's also calcite crystals, and these occur in places that spiritual people knew are important. In the pineal gland, they're discovering microcrystals, more microcrystals there, and in the brain, and they're associated. Another connection in relation to crystals is they've always been associated not only with dimensionality, but with directionality, with orientation. So the Vikings apparently used sunstone in relation to finding direction when it was cloudy, to find their way, because it was associated with the depolarized light. They could use that technology. And funnily enough, the origin of the word clock, it's kind of disputed, but one of the possible origins goes back to Columba. And in that context, I wonder whether the origin is not associated with the Latin for bell, but it goes back to the idea of a stone, because the word for a stone and in Irish and clock are very similar. And I think they did use. There was a lot of use of sunstone, and that would have been calcites or quartz in the context of their traveling. But there is a lot of evidence that humans and animals, of course, have a strong sense, magnetoreception, a strong sense of where things are and how to orientate. And there have been, as far as I understand, you know better than I, studies in Russia and I think in China, which focuses on this magnetic aspect in relation to psychic forces, and that may also play into the microtubule context that Hameroff and Penrose talked about in relation to the quantum context. So we know that there are crystals in the brain, but unfortunately, the people who are part of the security, industrial, military, pharmaceutical context know that as well. And the fruition of a lot of that stream going back through Bernal and that is the evolution of a lot of crystals, liquid crystals and carbon nanotubes that can be inserted in the human body. And increasingly I'm thinking that Elon Musk's talking about drilling a hole in your head and all this is a bit of a distraction from the reality of the future of brain-computer interfaces, because really the future will be liquid crystal. It will be insertion of nanotechnology into the brain, and graphene is ideal for this because it's biocompatible. It can link with neurons, and so really that's the future of transhumanism. It's from this crystal technology. So we better begin to inform ourselves a bit more about the science and about the work that's been done by scientists, as well as using the crystals for healing. But yes, liquid crystals, mood, and all that. It makes sense because they are revealing that the crystals with light reveal something about life. There's a nexus between crystals, light, and life, and that will continue to work out. And I believe that crystals, crystallography, and liquid crystals in particular, really will determine the future of the human race. I've no doubt about that. It is the critical technology. And there is in science, there are various scientists who have advocated a generalized crystallography. It goes across all the scientific endeavors. It was where we can see it in going back to Theophrastus, writing on stones at the time of Aristotle, right through to Plato and his structures, and also, I suppose, in the Pythagorean context, going up through art, in Dürer, in his Melancholia, a picture of 1514, you see this obsession with particular structures, or there's a famous painting of Luca Pacioli, the mathematician, and we see a polyhedron figure there. This was in art. Another thing that scientists do is they, as well as denying the influence of religion, they deny the influence of art in relation to the evolution of scientific theory, and they also deny the influence of emotion. So this intersection as well, the mood rings that you talked about, and Janelle's use of that, is a reflection of our emotional reaction, our emotional attraction, our aesthetic attraction, or interaction with these substances, and that emotion is important. And there's the last point, the coldness of crystals, or the perceived coldness of crystals, it reflects that view that you talked about, the uncreative view, the structured cold. We often talk about a person being cold or hard, and the mood, the reflective, the bright colours, the tau, the changing colourful tau, and your symbol reflects a wider emotional palette, I think.
Well, you have in Buddhism the idea of the Diamond Sutra, the pure, focused mind. Of course, I think the Diamond Sutra means a focus on the infinite, a focus on things you can't focus on. There's a paradox there. But diamonds, maybe I'm wrong about this, but as I understand it, diamonds are really compressed carbon.
Yes. And they're the same as the graphite used in pencils. So it's a different state, or a different, the structure becomes in a different state. So they're soft in that form. They can flow over another. And then the graphene is like this is a candle here, and the hexagonal structure of the candle. Graphene is a hexagonal structure, one atom thick, so it's a very thin, two-dimensional representation that grew out of that graphite and the work that people like Bernal did when they were searching for ways to control us effectively. So yes, and that's the interesting thing. There is in it something. There is in the study of crystallography something about the remarkable ability to transform, and I think there's a deeper message. And in the Bible, I think the most neglected study, or the thing that hasn't been explained sufficiently, is one of the apparitions of Jesus after the crucifixion, where he appeared, I think, to the two men on the road to Emmaus, and it says that Jesus appeared to them and in another form. So this is a remarkable phrase, and I've talked to communicate with scholars about this, and I've looked at it, and they say, well, this was added on afterwards, this part of the Gospel, Mark, and the latter part of Mark 16:12, I think. So Jesus appeared in another form. And I looked at the different translations of it, and you can't get away from it. The question is, what was the other form that Jesus appeared in? He was recognizable, but he was in a different form. And it's kind of neglected in relation to, again, a crystallized view, which says, oh no, Jesus appeared exactly as he was, and with resurrection means physical resurrection. And I've never really accepted that. I don't think that that's what resurrection is about. I think it's for me. But people would have to explain to me what that means in another form. What was the form? There is something which is explaining to us as well about the mutability of life, of form, of context. But at the same time, I think in the idea that ye are the salt of the earth, and you can lose your saltiness, there's a warning that we are in this form that we are in. If we become the sorcerer who wants to make themselves into gods, ignoring with hubris the great context which gets us here, well then we will lose the embodied quantum possibilities. And one of your guests has talked about quantum embodiment, and that I think there is the quantum element, but there's also the importance of our incarnation and our embodiment, as we've talked about before.
Well, all life on Earth is embodied in carbon forms. And at the same time, we are designing new kinds of thinking machines based on silicon. And the whole transhumanist movement is one that is suggesting we will eventually import our consciousness into a silicon form which has greater durability and is superior to the carbon form.
Yes, this is Bernal's idea, that we become transformed into silicon, and this is also the idea of the solid state entity that John C. Lilly, that you've talked to, he believed that this solid state entity would be made of silicon and nickel and iron, that's what was happening. And I think that's correct, that consciousness has been transformed into a technosphere, into a technical context. And as you were saying that, you were making me a bit apprehensive about his present preoccupation with carbon and carbon taxes and environmental. You're making me think about one could see a possible link. I'm not going to spell that out, but a possible link between this preference for silicon and the argument that this is universal. There are many theorists, there are a number of theorists who believe that the destiny of the world is to transform us into this material context. And then the humans, as they would notionally exist, would be some form of pattern of information. But of course, they would be a pattern of information integrated into a wider system. And in this, there's one point I think to mention. If we go back to William Blake didn't really agree with some of his radical friends about what they were arguing for. And I think he was kind of ahead of his time. He saw that some of the argument for equality was an argument for similarity, not equality. It wasn't about equality of treatment. It was an argument that things should be made the same. It was essentially an argument for standardization. So he emphasized commonality, but he emphasized the critical importance of difference. And that was a thing that he saw before most people have seen, even today. And Kepler, of course, studied ice and snowflakes, and he studied form. And of course, he identified the great diversity, despite the six-sided structure of the snowflake. They're all different. So, I mean, that's another interesting element. So the study of ice and structure and the way that people saw ice behaving led to a view that, a very strong view, it's manifest in people like Haeckel, that life was crystalline. It came from crystals, and the crystals were alive. So when they're nucleated, they grow, and they saw life in that. And I mean, here, the ice sings in many senses, and people would have thought that that was literally singing at one stage or other. So the connection with the essential connection, and this argument over the nature of life is critical, because according to the description of life given by Schrödinger and that, the same features could be found in crystal behavior, in relation to hereditary nature and in relation to emergence in particular, and that idea of emergence and the idea that, well, actually in relation to crystals, something emerges from something else. It's growing, and therefore it's lifelike. So it comes down to that same thing, that structured thing that enables people, or means that people don't see what life is. They don't see that joyous, creative, unpredictable, right brain, spiritual consciousness, imaginative, imaginal element of it. And particularly if they don't have that, if they're in their neuroplastic kind of context, doesn't enable them to see that. But what we don't want is the superimposition on our consciousness of a limited mechanistic, ultra-materialist, imperial scientistic, commercial corporatist viewpoint, which acts to crystallize our consciousness, because this is what the objective is. The objective from this trend is to apply the technology, like the light, and this is what Harari is talking about. It's like shining the light into the crystal. It's now we can see in your personality, and we can see, oh, this is Jeffrey in here. We found him. He was only an illusion anyway. He's only this aspect, this configuration, this pattern that we found him here on the chart. Look, that's who Jeffrey was, And of course, we don't believe in that. And your work in parapsychology is a vindication of the essentially incomprehensibility of the totality of consciousness, as people, as good scientists or adept scientists like Penrose, for example, argues or seems to have argued recently.
I have heard some people suggest, and as you speak, it seems appropriate, that this crystallization of consciousness began with Plato, who was obviously emphasized the Platonic solids, which were all crystals. That was the basis of his whole theory of the realm of forms. And people have suggested that prior to Plato, philosophy was really much more theurgic. It had a magical element to it. It had a sense of mystery. And what Plato and Aristotle did to philosophy was make it rational. And that was the beginning of the downfall of human consciousness.
I remember, and you've explored some of these ideas in the roots of consciousness and that continuity in your investigation from those times, and that's right. And there are many people that argue, Aristotle, Plato, different emphasis. I think there is an innate feature in the human mind that appears in all cultures. We could take, for example, Islam. And Islam was very interesting in that if you look at its art and architecture, and in particular because it didn't represent a human form, there's a very strong attraction, and particularly in Ottoman art, to essentially crystalline structure and quasi-crystals. And Penrose has looked at that as well. But there's even a deeper element, and we've talked about a different emphasis in Islam. For example, I noticed in a lot of the new mosques in Dubai and in Indonesia when I was there, and particularly I suppose it would have been Saudi-funded mosques, that they're very, very crystalline in totality. That they feel like you're in a crystal. And I mean, they're absolutely beautiful, but they're very, 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 very formed, crystalline. And Islamic art is beautiful, but that would be a different emphasis, I think, from the Sufi emphasis and the Sufi idea and extrapolation from crystals and precious stones. And in particular, some of the elements I see might have come up in Korban or in Surawardi, in the idea of illuminationism, points to the green man figure. This green figure is an important aspect, but it's an important aspect on the mystical level. It's an important aspect in the mystical domain, and the idea, whether it's in Plato or in a lot of the explorations of astrology or in the medieval Renaissance hierarchy, was of an earthly reflection of a heavenly system. So that, and we can see this in William Butler Yeats' essay on magic, where what he says was that you use symbols to get access to the great memory, and that's what the link is. So it's like the Akashic field. So the symbols are the key into this. So a lot of these things are symbols of the form represent something else. They're containers or conduits for something else. And the ultimate thing, nearly in all the spiritual traditions, is light. And light has that informless, unformed element to it associated with the photonic structure, which is only reflected in, say, photonic crystals, for example. It's only pointing us to something else. It's why the cathedrals, the medieval cathedrals, focused on the movement of light through the stained glass windows, which often had nanoparticles of gold in them, for example, to influence, to represent our connection to light. So there is it's that deeper crystalline view that can become a manifestation in life. It's a division, a dichotomy that runs through all the religions. There is this crystalline tendency and there is this opposite tendency, which is a light tendency. So it creates actually divisions, in my view, even within Christianity. The division there would be between, say, Teilhard de Chardin and Bernard Charbonneau and Jacques Ellul, who were critics of technology. Charbonneau wrote a book, I don't know if it's available in English, but he wrote a book in 1963. And he said that the title of the book translated is something like Teilhard de Chardin, a prophet of totalitarianism. So they saw in, I'm not saying these totalitarianism in the sense that they had seen with the Nazis, but they saw in this viewpoint of this integration of consciousness as a structural affair, as an attack on the embodiment, the incarnation of the human in their individual and different form, which is consistent with Blake. So we do have a real, again, Newton, Blake, we do have a real division. And again, Swedenborg is another example in his own life, because, of course, Swedenborg was in charge of the mines in Sweden. Sweden itself has been a great leader in relation to elements. There's something like 20 elements on the periodic table were discovered in Sweden, and the elementary structure, the categorization, I think Berzelius contribute or developed that. They're very, very interested in minerals. It's one of the richest countries for minerals and rare earths, and it's not surprising that a lot of the great thinkers began their careers, like Paul Hem and Swedenborg, worked in the mines. But he, of course, moves from that into the spiritual domain. He left the materialist basis behind, and the afterwards, the persistence of minerals for him and for crystals were in the visions of the next world, because in a lot of traditions, including in Judaism, there's crystal cities in the heavens. There's cities made of precious stones. This thing continues. So these precious stones we have here are reflections, are reminders of what happens in the higher context. In relation to Buddhism, there is this concentration on the clarity aspect, and the clarity aspect is critical, as far as I can see, in relation to the focus on the crystal. Again, for me, I think there's something to become something. We come to a different place. I'm not saying it's wrong. There's very wonderful insights that I would use, but it doesn't, for me, explain, or it doesn't finally explain the content element, because I don't think the content element will be ultimately this absolute clarity. I think there is messages about clarity, but who we are and whether we will be these kind of totally crystal clear beings, I'm not so sure. I think there is something of personality and difference that will persist, that, or otherwise heaven's not going to be a very interesting place for us. Or the afterlife.
Well, I guess there's a sense in which each of us is a flawed crystal.
Yes, and long live the flaws, because out of the flaws, out of the differences. There's another interesting connection, as you said that. Of course, we're dealing here with our liquid crystal faces, and face is another word associated with crystals. And interface, I couldn't identify where it came from, but it seemed to have come from the 1870s. I wonder whether it came from the crystal context. I don't know. So the word interface that comes up in this context refers, of course, to the human and computer context. It may have some association with faces in relation to crystal forms. And you could argue, I mean, I have argued that our consciousness is being crystallized. Our social interaction is being crystallized. We are being slowly, as we might visualize, I don't know if it's in the Disney cartoon, I watched it with the kids in the Snow Queen or whatever, going back to Hans Christian Andersen, that as we see a kind of ice forming, as we see that coldness spreading, this is what's happening to our consciousness when we project it outwards, when we exteriorize our consciousness, when we put our memories in a mobile phone and don't seek to memorize, when we don't seek to build up our memory, when we don't seek to build a memory palace like the magicians did in Renaissance time, when we don't do even what the PK man, what's his surname? Owens, Ted Owens, yeah. Well, what Ted Owens did and build up his memory as a protection. He thought it was important when you're dealing with other beings, as far as I remember from your book, which was in the tradition of the Renaissance magicians, that what we have is an exteriorization. We are being turned inside out, and that is what this incoming crystallization into the body will do. It will turn us inside out. You've no secrets left. We can look into your brain. We can look into your soul, Jeffrey. We can look inside of you. You don't have to have the Catholic confessions in order to find your deep, dark secrets. Now we have technology that will do it. It will some way reveal your deep, dark secrets. Now this, I'm not saying that you have them, just for the record, but this is a kind of assault, and it's the tentacles of the technosphere moving more and more into. So we voluntarily acquiesce by relinquishing control over functions that we engage in, by putting them into digital form, into silicon form. And at some point, we'll have to resist that. And you used the word, I had to refer back to what we talked about when you asked me whether I was a rebel. And I explained that using a rebel in an Irish context, I don't want to be on the next the watch list from Irish context. Irish rebels has a very particular meaning. But you're right in relation to the description as used by Alvin Toffler, because Alvin Toffler anticipated that you would have the people that love technology, the gadget worshippers, and you would have the people then that react against it and say, no, we don't want this, we don't want anything got to do with it. And then you would have what he called the techno-rebels. Now, he wasn't suggesting they were violent, but he said that this was the main group in the third wave, and they would make it. They would come along. He said they could be nuclear scientists. They were people that understood technology. And they came along, they said, okay, this over-reliance on technology is too much, and it's destructive. And they would be the ones that would come, like the salt in Jacob Boehme in the middle, and they would be the determinant factor. because they understood the technology and they understood what would happen if it became pervasive, and they would be the driving force. He saw in the 80s more and more people become thinking that way, and some of your friends that you've done interviews with that saw some of the dangers of computing and saw the possibilities of where it would go wrong, were aware of that, and he may have been referring to some of them. But he's right in that. So the people that will, if there is to be a corrective in the middle path, will be informed of technology, will know. They won't be against technology, but they will want appropriate technology. And that he described them as techno-rebels in the future, or future techno-rebels. And that description is a useful one in relation to people who want to rebalance the two things. And part of that would be a rebalancing of an overly crystallizing, deadening, cold and hardening force based on removing the warmth, if you like, of the free will of the mistaken individual who makes mistakes, who changes like the prodigal son, or does things that they're not supposed to, but learns and understands the value of things through exploration.
Well, James Tunney, once again, a fascinating, multifaceted structure, both crystalline in its clarity and multifaceted in its many dimensions. I'm sure it's going to give our viewers a lot of questions to think about, and I would encourage our viewers to ask themselves, where might each of us in our own thinking have become a little over-crystallized? I know I'm going to think about that.
I'll even do that myself, Jeffrey, if I can. I will, yeah. But on the last point, in this, I was thinking about this a lot, and in particular relation to Goethe, and a view which is very dominant. It's very dominant, actually, in relation to a reductionist approach to consciousness, a mathematical approach. I can see it, for example, in relation to Douglas Hoffman, and in relation to his view that we're, relying on the optical effects and that to say, oh, well, we can't perceive the world very much, and therefore we're mistaken about how we perceive the world. We're very limited.
Donald Hoffman.
Sorry, Donald Hoffman. I keep saying Douglas Hoffman. Apologies for that. Apologies, Donald, in case you're ever looking. And Donald Hoffman, yes, very interesting man. But in this view, it also accords. David Icke, I've heard expressing this view as well, that our viewpoint is so limited that we don't see the rest of the world. I don't agree with both of their views. I believe that, and this is, for me, a positive note, that in the narrow band of perception that we have, that we are in that band that Goethe talked about, in that rainbow band between light and darkness. We're in that. And in that, we're given all the clues we need to determine whatever future we want. All the crystallographers are reliant on perceptions, emotions, attractions, intuitions that were inherent, that were almost built into us, that were built into the environment through the whatever evolution, creation process happened. And the artists realized very, very quickly that we could find all the answers. The people that developed some of the mathematics in the Renaissance, understood about vision, they realized that we had everything we needed through observation, through looking at color, through looking at the spectrum, through understanding the emotional impact of colors, as Goethe talked about, to understand life, to understand the interrelationship with our relationship with plants, which are also very dependent on internal crystals in relation to photosynthesis, to look at those relationships. We have everything we need to uncover the secrets, to look in, to use light to apply in our domain. So we're not blinded creatures in that. And in many senses, limitation is the basis of our success. So in that, we can find the beauty in ourselves and the beauty externally, and choose the path. It's in our hands. And I hear people, and sometimes they may think that I have that view, a dystopian view of the world. I don't have that view. I think this is an incredible place we live in. There's incredible beauty. What the artists were trying to do was to identify and point to that beauty. And what the spiritual leaders are pointing to the beauty of ourselves. And we also have to re-emphasize the beauty of nature that we live in, and not be obsessed with an unduly narrow view. So I think we should celebrate and look at the way that when Newton said that he was on the shoulder of giants, when these guys are coming today in particular, they say, well, you people don't understand, you have narrow viewpoint, you can't understand that, and religion didn't give it to you. It was us scientists that gave you all the insight. It's just not true. There's a whole range of different ways of looking at the world that has brought us to the point. They don't accept responsibilities for negative effects. They want to, as in Seinfeld, big salad us all with and claim that they have the unique view, and that's why spiritual approaches and the approach of parapsychology, the openness to different ways of viewing the world and to understanding the unknown, are very important to get the balance right. Thank you again, and I look forward to our future conversation. Thank you.
Well, it's been a great pleasure as always, James. Thank you for being with me. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.